And welcome back to 35,000 Watts, the podcast. My name is Michael Millard. I'm here with Keith Porterfield and Scott Mobley. We are three ex-college radio DJs and executive staffers. And today we are actually talking about music documentaries. And in case you don't know, 35,000 Watts, the story of college radio, is in fact a music documentary and is now available on Amazon Prime and on Google Play. So you can rent or buy 35,000 Watts right now if you go to Amazon Prime Video, check it out. Or if you're a Google person, go to Google Play and check it out. So we wanted to talk about our favorite, I guess, college radio related music documentaries. All three of these docs are about bands that were most definitely college radio bands. So you get kind of a taste of college radio music and college radio culture when you watch these docs, but also being that this is a college radio podcast, that's important. But it's also kind of, it's a podcast about music documentaries as well. So this is the first time we've really talked about film or docs and that subject. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. We're going to kick it off today with Mr. Scott Mobley's choice.
All right, so I will just start by giving the title here, and I want to give a little backstory after that. But this movie I've chosen is Another State of Mind. It is from 1984. People that know me know that the only thing I'm nerdier about than music is movies. And so when I made a short list of music docs to do for this show, it was probably 35 films I wrote down that could have been what I'm talking about right now. The reason I kept going back to this one is because this was really a formative movie for me back in the day, back in the 80s. And so just a little backstory on this. Back in the old days, kids, we had this thing called cable television. And but basically there was a cable channel called USA that did a block of programming called Up All Night. And it was like, I want to say 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. every Friday, Saturday night, whatever it was. I forget the exact, all of that. But basically they would show late at night things they couldn't show during the day and things that were a little maybe cult oriented or, kind of bizarro movies and stuff like that. Well, one thing that they showed all the time was this movie, Another State of Mind. It is a documentary made in 1982 about two up-and-coming punk bands going on tour for the first time, and basically how sort of everything goes wrong. It's like the Spinal Tap of hardcore punk, Except it's really, what's happening to these kids really isn't that funny. But I remember seeing this movie. I would have been 12, 13 years old at the time and seeing this on TV late at night. And I sort of became mildly obsessed with it. I watched it all the time. Every time it was on, I probably saw it 20, 30 times. And then sort of maybe forgot about it. But I revisited it again a couple years ago. And of course, I watched it again this week. And I was just really taken back to how much this movie really sort of opened my eyes to what that world was. So to describe the film a little bit, there are two bands here. One is called Youth Brigade. The other one is Social Distortion. People listening probably heard of one of those, I'm assuming. But both of these bands are unsigned Southern California punk bands playing clubs and, whatever. They decide to rent a bus and go on tour together and sort of travel around the U.S. and Canada. The bus breaks down everywhere they go. They can't get paid everywhere they go. They sleep in buses. They sleep in hostels. They run into different people. That's the basic gist of the movie. But what's interesting about it is how everywhere they go, there is a culture there. There is a group of like-minded individuals who are enjoying this music and enjoying this scene that they've created. And on the counter side of that, there's also people that are trying to sort of rein them in and stop them. There's a scene where they go to a group of Christians that are trying to convert these kids, into Christianity and get them off the streets and get them off drugs, that kind of thing. And they run into all these different groups around Canada and the U.S. And you sort of see that there's this little subculture going on that, for me at that time, was only presented as this scary thing, this, oh my God, these punk kids, what are they doing? They're hurting each other and they're doing drugs and when you watch a movie like this, you really see that's not what it was. It's not, certainly drugs and alcohol and promiscuous sex and all the other tools of the devil are certainly part of it, but it's not really what it was about. It's really about these disenfranchised kids that have found each other and formed this sort of community around each other. And that really struck me when I was a young person. Like I said, I would have been 12, 13 years old. I didn't necessarily love all of this music. And I have always found it interesting that Social Distortion is even here, because Social Distortion is barely a punk band, much less a hardcore band. They're really a straight up rock and roll band. And if you watch this movie, to me anyway, their songs really stick out. Like, every band in this movie kind of sounds like hardcore punk, and they sound like Black Flag and those bands. When Social D plays a song, it sounds totally different. It sounds like they're in the wrong place almost, and that really struck me too. So I fell in love with Social D from this movie. It would be years before they got really famous, maybe 5, 6, 7 years later, but I always love these guys. I love the song that Mike Ness writes in the movie. But more than that, I think this is where I really went, there are other kinds of music and there are other scenes out there that are not being given to me on a normal basis that I am interested in. And this is really where I kind of fell in love with the idea of alternative music, even though I necessarily didn't love these bands, all of them. I love Social D, but I didn't love all of these bands. I loved that they were doing something different. And so I really kind of credit this movie with my later love of things alternative and things different and things outside the mainstream, things like that. So just to kind of touch on this really quick, there were a couple of controversies with this movie. The biggest one being that there is a scene where they're showing, I think it's during the part, I'm trying to catch it this time. It's during the scene where they're talking about moshing and what moshing is and what slam dancing is. And that part where that kid does the demonstration of what moshing is cracks me up every time. They are showing a group of people in a mosh pit or whatever, and they are playing a Youth Brigade song called Violence. That's not who's playing on the stage in that scene. And it is, in fact, Bad Religion that's playing in that scene. Another band that was not yet signed at the time and whatever. So Bad Religion came out years later and said, that movie sucks. It doesn't tell the truth and blah, blah, blah. But they're really just talking about that. They're talking about the fact that they're playing and you're hearing a different band. So that was one little controversy that I think is kind of nothing. And then the other one was that this movie was accused of being a sort of propaganda piece for the BYO, which was I think it was called the Better Youth Organization, which was founded by the members of Youth Brigade. It was basically this idea that they were going to help kids, not get in trouble and not get wrapped up in drugs and alcohol and all this kind of stuff. They kind of created this sort of good vibes group. But people complained about this movie being a propaganda piece for that. It's barely mentioned. And in fact, I think they spend much more time on Discord House, which was Ian MacKay's straight edge movement thing in DC. They spend way more time talking about that than they do about the BYO, which is essentially the same thing. So I think a lot of these controversies were just the other bands maybe sort of being upset about, these bands getting hyped up and their band not getting hyped up. I think it's more of a grudge thing than anything else. And so the last thing is that, there are people interviewed in this movie that are sort of treated like just another member of the punk scene. There's interviews with a guy named Keith, and it just says Keith on the screen. Well, that's Keith Morris. He founded Black Flag and the Circle Jerks, and those bands were established at the time. And then when they get to Washington, D.C., we have Ian, this punk Ian. That's Ian MacKay. He created Fugazi and Minor Threat. Like, these were legitimate punk pseudo icons at the time that were sort of presented as, we just found this guy on the street, let's talk to Keith, and it's not that. These guys were legit. So those are some of the complaints about it. But overall, I think, and watching it again this week, it really just takes me back to a time when I felt like my brain was opened up to this new thing. And even though I didn't necessarily understand it, and I certainly wasn't disenfranchised enough to, leave home and go live on the streets with these kids, I was fascinated by them. And I was fascinated by the fact that they had found each other and bonded around this music. And it really, like I said before, I really do credit this with being the start of my journey into alternative music. So that's another state of mind. What'd you guys think?
Super authentic, like unvarnished. It felt like you were definitely seeing these kids as they were. There's no polish, there's no attempt to kind of like clean it all up, which I liked. I think, one thing that has changed that made documentary filmmaking, I think, I don't want to say more important back then, but the fact that they were able to capture that moment in time, right? They were able to capture that tour. They were able to capture these kids. And I keep saying kids because they were all like 17, 18, 19, 20, I think, pretty much across the board. Like you said, they were not signed yet. Social D was not anything like what it was going to be, by 88, 89, 90. They were a pretty big band, especially in the college radio world. But at that time, I doubt many people, if anybody, knew who they were outside LA. These days, you're able to capture all that yourself. And I think bands are able to, even young unsigned bands are able to video and capture all these moments, and they can record themselves on tour and record themselves on, doing all the things. And like that really wasn't something that was super accessible in 82 in particular. You could get maybe a video camera, but I think these kids couldn't have even, I doubt they could have afforded a video camera. It didn't look like. So that, if that documentary crew hadn't been there, and then by documentary crew, I mean probably a handful of people with cameras and maybe a couple lights. They did have a truck at the end, you find out, that had been following them. But before that, it just looked like another kid with a camera was kind of just embedded with them. And it definitely feels that way.
I pictured like the big camcorder on someone's shoulder,
it's the shoulder mount.
Had to be what it was,
And yeah, that, I think that function isn't as critical these days as it was, because so many people are able to do that themselves now, and everybody has a phone in their pocket. So I think maybe we forget how lucky we are to have these like artifacts where someone actually followed these kids on tour and got to kind of see what that vibe was like, because it captures so much of the ethos of punk and the sincerity of these kids, even when they are a bit pretentious and a bit overwrought by certain things, and like they talk a mile a minute and they've got a million ideas in their head. They also seem pretty smart across the board, pretty well spoken in a lot of ways, things that you don't necessarily maybe associate with the punk movement until you kind of see what was driving these kids. And they were coming at it, particularly Sean Stern, the leader of Youth Brigade, really seemed, and Ian McKay for that matter, like they had an ethos that they were kind of going for. Like they wanted to do more than just play music. They wanted to help kids and give kids some hope, and you see that all come out, and it's very, I don't want to say surprising, but it's the juxtaposition of what these kids look like and the music they're making versus kind of how well spoken they are a lot of the time, and certainly how sincere they are. It comes across really strongly in the movie, and like it's hard to deny that. Again, even at times where it's like, I mean, maybe those aren't kids you would necessarily want to spend. You certainly wouldn't want to spend 5 weeks in a school bus with them. I think they all found that out.
Yeah.
It really does open your eyes to things that I don't think you would obviously think or know about if you just saw them say, come in, do their show and leave. There was a lot more going on to that with them, and I'm sure with a lot of the other punk bands that were out on the road. So I think that was kind of my biggest takeaway, was just getting to peek behind the curtain and see a lot of it. So there's some other moments, but I'll let Keith kind of weigh in first, and then we can circle back. There was a few eye-raising moments as well, but yeah, I'm curious what Keith thought, since this was his first time too.
Like I said, it was my first time to see it. I came away with two kind of primary takeaways from it, and you guys actually both touched on, each of you touched on one of them. The first one that Scott mentioned was just how much more talented Mike Ness was than everybody else involved in any of that.
Yeah.
Like, from the songwriting perspective, from the singing, from the guitar playing, from all of it, you could tell. I guess, it'd be interesting to see that in like 83, 84 and see if people walked out of that and came out saying, well, that was fine, that music was okay, but that one dude, Mike Ness, is going to be a star, because he was by far and away the most talented guy, in all of that. And I, think that showed out later in his career with what Social D would go on to do later on. And then, Mike, you touched on the other thing that really stood out to me. And you described it as being sincere. I was going to describe it as optimism, just kind of the nature of youth when you're that young and you've got an idea that you've really latched onto, just how it can infect your head and drive, everything you do, your career choices, or although, with these guys calling their music choices a career might be a little much. I don't know how much Youth Brigade went on to do after this, but it still was just really interesting to me, when you're at that age, and everybody I think kind of goes through it, where you latch onto something and it becomes like the central thing in your life. And with these kids, it was the punk movement. And when you saw him go to different cities, one of the first things that Sean, what was his last name again? Stern? For the guy from Stern. One of everything he talked about, every stop that they made, one of the things he would always mention were how the kids were. Oh, the kids were really good here. They helped us out. They put us up. They fed us. Or, there wasn't much of a scene here. The kids weren't really into it or whatever. And so I thought that was neat to get a look at kind of the punk subculture and kind of the optimism in all of those young people at that time, thinking that they were latching on to this movement that was particularly going to change the world. They were talking about the various members of the people that talked, whether they were members of the band or whether they were just people that were in the scene, were talking about, the status quo has failed us, and the family structure isn't working anymore, or we don't believe in the ideals that the church is pushing on us. And so they had found the subculture where they all come together, and it was about positivity, and it was about we're going to do this thing, not just rebelling against all the things we don't like, but we have created this scene and this thing that's different, and it's ours, and we're going to latch onto it and make it something, And I thought that was neat. I thought that was cool. It obviously didn't really work out for them, at least not most of them, But yeah, that was one of my key takeaways from it too. Like you mentioned, is the sincerity and the optimism of the youth movement, at that time, and how for those folks it all came down to the punk movement and how into it they were. It was neat. It was a cool, like you say, little slice of time. For a certain kind of youth culture, and that was really interesting.
I think you're absolutely right, and that's really, to me, where the movie latched on to me. I liked I remember when I found this movie when I was a kid, I liked the music. I remember that most of all, that especially the song Another State of Mind, that they kind of show Mike Ness writing throughout the course of the movie, and then they play it over the end credits. I adore that song. I always have. And it was one of the first punky songs I remember really liking. But yeah, what really got me, I don't know if you guys remember this or not, but at that time, probably even maybe a little before this movie was filmed in 82 and then it comes out in 84. Between that, Social D had their first album. But in 82, we were presented the punk movement on television as this horrific subculture movement that was going to destroy our children, and what is wrong with kids today and all that stuff. It was that times a million. And there's a very famous clip from the Phil Donahue show where he had on a bunch of punks that kind of start yelling at the audience and spitting on people and whatever. They're all basically just I think they got these kids in a room and said, okay, everybody do your best Sid Vicious for 35 minutes, and then that's what they did. That's how this was presented to us. And then when I found this movie, I was like, wow, that's not what this is. This is these kids trying to not do what everyone's telling them to do, and be a culture, be a group, be together. And they're obviously taking care of each other, and they're obviously bound around something that adults couldn't understand. And that's kind of what makes it cooler, The other thing I was going to mention just real quick is that I don't remember if this movie was heavily edited for the USA Network when they showed it. They did show it late at night, but I don't remember the language. And the other thing I don't remember at all is the naked girl at the end, the girl that they find that's like an artist, and they show a bunch of naked pictures of her. Believe me, 12-year-old me would have remembered that. And I don't remember that at all. So I think that was edited out. And to be honest, they should go back and edit it out again. It adds nothing to the movie except maybe a couple of minutes. Maybe they were just trying to get it up to 75 minutes. I don't know. But yeah, that part is kind of pointless. But yeah, that came on and I was like, wait a minute. I don't remember this, because I certainly would have.
Yeah, I love that they kind of show the punk houses. There's these houses where all these punks live, and they have the shows, because that's something that continued to be part of punk culture. When I was interviewing Hagfish, and they were talking about, when they got started in Dallas, and this would have been the late 80s or early 90s before they recorded their albums in like 93, 94, they would go to punk houses and do shows like in Fort Worth or Arlington, just around the DFW area. And I know that continued even into the late 90s and probably beyond. But I obviously was not in touch with the culture, or never really was in touch with the punk culture in any real way. But I was aware that was kind of a thing. But to see that the early punk houses and just like the camaraderie and like, hey, we're going to make a giant pot of chili and try to feed everybody in the band to come, and they're all going to eat, and these guys are making like $10 a day if they were lucky. That's what they thought they were going to make. I think they ended up making significantly less than that. They were happy to get 5, and just that was interesting. But again, it speaks to that, to the culture and to the camaraderie and to kind of like Keith was saying, the optimism of youth and like banding together because they all thought they were kind of part of thought they were part of a movement. They were part of a movement. So that was kind of cool. Definitely some tough moments too. Like I had a really hard time watching them talk to Marcel, the kid in the wheelchair that had been like hit by a car and in a coma. And like, is he getting health care that he needs? Not clear. Like he doesn't seem like he should be just out on the street in a wheelchair. It seems like he should probably be in a hospital. So like that was tough to see. But I think homeless kids and kids that were living on the street were always a part of punk culture too. So I think seeing that was, the girl who's kind of telling her story and was kind of the downer part of the film for sure. But I think an important part of that, because that was, I do think punk culture kind of embraced those people. And then I think people, like you were saying, kids that wanted to leave home found themselves kind of either drawn towards or embraced by that type of culture at that time. So that was kind of interesting to see, but that was definitely a bit tough to watch. My favorite moment, I would say, I really loved the Youth Brigade and Social D, and watching their tour obviously is the attraction. And I'm not a huge fan of Minor Threat or a huge fan of Straight Edge or whatever. Seeing them play in that basement where the roof wasn't even 5 feet tall, I don't think, and they're crammed in a basement where like the guy couldn't even stand up straight, and they're just jamming and rocking out in like an honest to God basement. I mean, like I've never seen such a small space before, a band trying to play. Like that was kind of cool because there's just so clearly like wherever the fuck we can put a drum set in and squeeze some amps, and like if we can play without getting kicked out, that's what we're gonna do. And I mean, they were just jammed in that little spot, but they were rocking out. That was pretty cool to see. So yeah, some lowlights and some highlights for me.
You mentioned it, but one of my favorite things is the chili scene, because that kid opens the door and he's like, "Hey, come on in, have some chili." Like even Canadian punks are super nice. Like
Right.
That part's great. And yeah, you're right. There are some sort of downer moments like Marcel, and I find that French Canadian girl's. It's not, her story is sad. It's her delivery that's sad. She's so like, that's just her world. Like that. She's so nonchalant about it. It's rather heartbreaking because, I mean, they don't say, but that girl can't be more than 17, 16 years old. And she's, that's just her life. That's what she does, and
Ennui would leap to mind in terms of the way she came across.
Yeah.
That's the word. I think that's a word I never have, I maybe ever used, but it's a case I think it couldn't possibly be more correct. But yeah, she's also tough to watch. Seeing I think that was juxtaposed with the discussion with Marcel. So seeing her was a relief after.
Yeah,
Marcel.
True.
Boy, man.
And what you said about the live performances, yeah, that's absolutely one of the things that was always appealing about that to me, is the sort of DIY aesthetic of punk, is that, we don't need a concert hall. We don't need a theater. If there's 4 outlets in the wall and a corner we can put a drum kit in, then we're going to rock it out. And I didn't really, at the time when I was watching this movie as a young man, I didn't really appreciate Minor Threat and that kind of stuff. But watching it this time, I was like, oh, I get this. I get why this was appealing to people. It has such a raw ethos to it that's just, it's so, if that's where your brain wants to go, it takes you there, and I certainly appreciate Minor Threat for what they were. I was told, and I tried to look this up, and it's kind of hard to find information, but I was told that Discord House, which is Ian MacKaye and Minor Threat's house, the one that they show in the film, that still exists. I have a feeling that over the years it's probably gotten nicer, and maybe it's more of a organization now or something, but not quite the flop house it was in 82 when they filmed this, but that he still takes in kids that are on the streets or whatever and gives them a place to stay and stuff. So that part of it never went away.
You mentioned the parts of that were a little hard to watch. And toward the end of it, most of that stuff is toward the end of the movie, the stuff with Marcel and the Quebecois girl. But is also toward the end is when the other, people involved with the tour, the band members and the roadies and all start slowly dropping away. They go from 11 people in the bus down to 9, and before it's all over, they're down to 4. And I think there's a good parallel there, kind of also when you are that young and you're into a culture like that, it's not ever going to last. It's very few people that were involved with that are still involved in the punk movement right now. I bet most of those kids ended up getting married and having kids and doing the normal thing, and I think it's neat that, kind of as the movie goes on, you kind of see that kind of slow disintegration as things kind of break down and all the band members are leaving and the roadies are leaving. And at the end of it, the youth brigade and the one roadie that are left they're having to abandon the bus because the bus is completely broken down and they're having to catch a ride back in the truck, the TV truck or the film truck. Just kind of a neat parallel there, I think, to kind of how, you get to see the scene at its best, and then you also get to see kind of the scene as it's disintegrating toward the end, and I thought that was neat too. I would ask, Scotty, I don't know Social D as well as you do. Everybody left Mike Ness on that. He was the last member of Social D still on that tour. Did those guys get back with him? Are they still the band Social D, or did he get a completely different band after that?
Yeah, so they kind of revolving doored for a while at that time and then settled on the lineup. But I'm not 100% on this, but I am pretty sure that the band that recorded, not the album that came out right about the time this movie did, I think this band recorded that album. But then after that, it's been Mike Ness and a revolving door of other guys. And I think as early as like the late 80s, probably when they really started to break out, none of the guys you saw in this movie were in that band.
Gotcha. I was wondering.
I was curious about that too. I think one of the guys stuck with him for a while, like through up until like they had the major label breakthrough and stuff. But everybody else.
And some of them left and came back. And it's one of those. If you go to Social D's Wikipedia page, where it has the former members. Yeah. It's like 2 pages. It's its own page. It's its own page. Yeah, a lot of people have been in that band. So yeah.
No, I laughed because I went, and usually it's like you go to a band page and it's it's got their history, their the discography, and then the members, and usually there's a nice little chart. Sometimes people have made of like when people came.
Oh yeah, the timeline.
Bands like The Cure, who have had plenty of people in and out. Yeah. Social D has like a click here to actually see the page go through. So she'll just to make it totally.
It's a lot of dudes have come in and out of that band, and it's always been Mike Ness's band. He's always kind of been the driving force of that band, and it's not like in a band like that, the musicians are relatively interchangeable. There's not a whole lot going on that you need, world-class musicians for. What you do need is a great songwriter, and Mike Ness is that. So I think he's the key to their success. And you really see that in this movie. I hope, anyone who goes and watches this, you really need to notice, like, when they play a Youth Brigade song or they play a Minor Threat song or any of the other things you hear in this movie, and then you hear a Social D song, there is a noticeable difference in the quality of the songwriting and presentation of those songs.
Yeah, songwriting in particular, I would say. Yeah, the performances they're all very raw, obviously, all of them. But yeah, you can tell. You can definitely tell that like Social D is onto something. You can just kind of feel it.
You just see it, that this band... Then maybe not they're going to make it big. Maybe that's not your thought, but like whatever this band is a little bit better. They're better than whatever all this is, and you hear it loud and clear in this movie.
Yeah, super enjoyable. Highly recommended. It's on YouTube, so it's free. Another State of Mind, the documentary. Obviously, there is also a song by Social D called that as well.
I just wanted to say on that real quick. I kind of had one of the reasons I hesitated with this movie because it was kind of hard to find, and I really don't like the YouTube thing because they're always, this looks like crappy VHS, and that's what it is. So I don't think this looked any better 40 years ago when it was made. This is what it looks like. So you have my approval to watch it on YouTube. This is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I don't think it's, obviously, as someone who just made a movie and is would like to recoup some of my costs someday on it, I don't recommend just going to YouTube and pirating movie if it's not supposed to be on YouTube or whatever. I looked everywhere. I was not able to find anywhere that I could give someone money to watch this where I thought the money would go back to the filmmakers or at all. So like, I think it's fine to watch this one on YouTube. It's been out for 40 years. I doubt that. I don't think you could give money to the filmmakers even if you wanted to. So
I don't think you could find them if you wanted to.
I don't think you could. Honestly, I think you could. All right, so we're actually going to break there. We had so much fun talking about these documentaries that we're actually going to break this episode up into a couple of episodes. Otherwise, it would be far too long. So next week, we're going to talk about another fantastic rock documentary. We had a great time talking about Another State of Mind, so go check it out. And if you have some time, go check out 35,000 Watts, The Story of College Radio. It's available right now to rent or buy on Amazon Prime and Google Play. Thanks again for listening. Thanks to Keith and Scott. We'll see you next week on 35,000 Watts, the podcast.